Okay, thank you everyone. And we are about to go to our final session on the future of the dollar. And as they get the stage ready, please join me as I welcome up to the stage Candace Kelly, Chief Legal Officer, Stellar Development Foundation, Saleha Mohsin, Senior Washington Correspondent for Bloomberg, Shambaugh, Undersecretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury, and Stefan Simon, member of the Management Board, Chief Executive Officer, Americas, and Chief Legal Officer, Deutsche Bank. I could not have asked, and we could not have asked for a better group to close us out today in this important topic. And those who know the Geoeconomics Center know that we could not have had an event if we did not talk about the future of the dollar. And I'm grateful to this group for joining me today. So thank you all, and please have a seat. Well, thank you all for being here. And Saleha, I'm going to start with you, since you literally wrote the book on the topic. And for those who haven't seen it, Paper Soldiers, highly recommend it. Check it out. We just heard from Ambassador Huntsman on the future of the dollar. We debate this topic all the time. We've talked about this extensively. Just set the scene for us a little, the state of the dollar and how we measure it from a U.S. perspective.
Well, the most important thing is that it's not going anywhere anytime soon. There is, like Ambassador Huntsman said, every decade there is a new perceived threat to the dollar, which is the world's reserve asset, since the 1940s. It is on one end of 92% of all transactions around the world, whether you are dealing with the US directly in some way or another. So it's still very, very strong. It's deeply entrenched. There are fresh discussions about de-dollarization that have stemmed from February 2022, when the US led the world in imposing really, really harsh economic sanctions on Russia. And ever since those economic sanctions, there's been a renewed effort among some countries, the BRICS economies and the growing club that has become, to think about ways to circumvent the dollar, but they have not actually found any successful ways to do that. Mm-hmm. But all of this is not to say that the US should be complacent. The US should pay attention. Treasury officials should pay attention, because it's not a status that should be taken for granted. The US and everyday Americans benefit a lot from living in a country where the currency is the world's reserve asset.
Well, that's a perfect transition to you, Undersecretary. Thank you for being here. I know it's been a busy day. I just saw you on Bloomberg a few hours ago. What is Treasury's role in preserving the dollar as the international reserve currency? We almost take it as a default. We're the international reserve currency. We've been the international reserve currency for coming on a century. How does Treasury think about preserving that on a day-to-day?
And we think about it a lot, honestly. We don't take it for granted at all. We definitely are not complacent about it. I think when we use economic tools for national security purposes, we think really hard about what are the unintended consequences, what are the spillovers of that. So we're very cognizant on that end. And I think part of it is we do see the current role of the dollar is in the US national interest, right? Not just for the reasons just laid out, which I very much agree with, right? But also it's in our interest because in some sense of why people use the dollar, right? It is, in some sense, it's network effects and hysterices and all that, but it's also the governance, the rule of law, the deep liquid financial markets. All of those things bring us benefits too, but they also bring benefits to the rest of the world. Other people benefit, not just US households, from a stable dollar system. And so we take it very seriously that we want to maintain that system and be cognizant of it. And even when we talk about the actions in February of 22, we didn't take them by ourselves, right? And so when you say, if the US had done something big and no one else joined us, then you might say, would people prefer to use the euro or the Swiss franc or the yen? Everybody moved, or all the major currencies moved at once. And so that, I think, helps not undermine the dollar when you use it in that way.
And Treasury, in addition to what you laid out, of course, as we talked about earlier today in our sessions, incredibly important role in sanctions enforcement. And we do a lot of work on this at the Geoeconomics Center. And I wonder how you think about dividing the national security role of the dollar versus the macroeconomic role of the dollar. Meaning sometimes I think, and we show this in our research, countries could be undermining the use of the dollar in sanctions, even if we're not seeing anything on the top line, macro, currency reserves, the way we usually measure strength. Do you think about the dollar in those two ways?
We do a lot, and I think the people who are working a little more on the national security side and the people who are more on the macro side, like we're talking a lot and trying to compare notes. But the other thing I would say is that the more national security, or in some sense, or sometimes it's legal orientation use of the dollar, whether it's sanctions or AML, CFT rules and things like that, those also support the other side of the dollar, right? Like we want a well-functioning international financial system that doesn't have a lot of terrorist financing flows in it. We want to have a stable international order. Frankly, we don't want large countries invading their neighbors for no reason, right? Those things all play into the just general macroeconomic benefits we're looking for. So sometimes you're using it for national security purposes, but those kind of rebound to the other side as well.
I think that's a really helpful way to look at it. It's an ecosystem that complements itself. Stefan, let me turn to you. The Undersecretary brought up the euro. Let's talk about the euro, because what was so fascinating among the many things when the sanctions packages were put in place was the unity that the Undersecretary mentioned. How has that, from your perspective at Deutsche Bank, being this large multinational bank but based in Europe, changed the way investors think about the euro? And how have you as a bank played a role in basically being the implementer of a lot of the economic statecraft of the G7?
Well, look, Josh, if you point the question in the direction of would the euro endanger the dollar currency role in the world, I think the bottom line answer is no. And there are various reasons for that. We heard already that in essence where people turn to and what currency they use is determined by a mixture of ingredients, but if you want to boil them down, it's economic strength, which is determined by trade flows and foreign direct investments. And on the other hand, what I would call political stability and leadership. And if you look at these elements and compare the US and Europe today and in the foreseeable future, I think it's pretty clear that the euro will not be, so to say, in a position and a role to undermine the dollar as the lead currency. You read the Draghi report, you know what structural issues we have in Europe, in Germany in the coming years. I think it's very clear that trade flows are turning towards the US, even more foreign direct investments are turning much more towards the United States. And in terms of leadership and political stability, even there are a lot of adversaries out there, but I think nobody would really contest or make the case that Europe is the leading anchor of the global political order. So I think there's no, so to say, movement in that direction. And then you look just, so to say, in the sanctions context, and you are aware of that, there are European initiatives or ideas that were created, and to some extent even some nation states try to implement them to circumvent US sanctions by proposing euro usage versus dollar. It didn't go anywhere, right? So I think, be realistic, there is no threat from the euro towards the dollar as the lead currency. Now, is that a good message or not? I would say, looking from a European perspective, there's also a lot of we take away from that should make us think, what is it that we need to do and what homework do we have to do in Europe?
Do you think the Draghi report recommendations are part of the answer to that?
I think they are part of the problem statement, and in the last couple of quarters there were already a lot of discussions in Europe and in circles about the structural weaknesses of Europe, and I think the Draghi report is a very good compendium to bring all that together in a comprehensive document, laying it out. When it comes to what are the answers to that problem statement, I would say I'm a little bit more skeptical for, in essence, two reasons. The question is, will we have the political and governance structures and leadership in Europe to really execute against them, even if we could agree these are, or at least in its core, the right measures? Are we really ready to execute? And if you look at the leadership and governance structure in Europe, I would have a couple of question marks on that one. And the other I would highlight is, I think there is a mindset or perception issue in Europe, and I mean not in the European political elites that are running countries and making decisions, but in the German population and European population, which is in essence to the question, do we really need growth? Why is growth important? Do we really need wealth creation? Why is wealth creation important? From a also geo-economic and in essence geopolitical perspective. And I think this mindset is not there and not strong enough. So, which means there's likely, at least currently, not enough push also towards the political elites to say, hey, we want you to execute against some of these ideas.
And ultimately, that's a problem both for Europe and the US as a strong allies, because as a weaker Europe goes, so this transatlantic alliance suffers.
Absolutely. I think for the United States, that actually you could debate whether that turns to a problem of national interest for the United States, because a weak Europe is not in the interest of the United States, not only because you have a weak trading partner, but also in defense terms, you have a weak partner on your east flank, and my proposition to the United States would be, you are interested in having a strong partner on your east flank.
It's a good message for the Transatlantic Forum on geoeconomics. Candace, let me turn to you on digital assets. You know, one thing we wonder, and we've talked about this, on central bank digital currencies, on stable coins, do they create more fragmentation of the financial system as countries pursue? We were talking with Ambassador Huntsman about their domestic technology stacks, or is it actually this is a way to create more cross-border financial flows and break down some of the barriers?
Well, I want to start by just talking about the technology, and then the frameworks on top of that that are needed. But the technology itself, the reason to use blockchain technology to have digital assets is to break down those. It's global, it's interoperable, it's cross. You know, if you look at the uses, the actual uses that are really powerful with blockchain technology on open public networks, it's cross-border payments, it's delivering aid, it's helping people in countries like Argentina that have a volatile currency hold a stable coin that's backed by a US dollar. It's creating more access and inclusion for people who've been excluded from the financial system. And so when you talk about that in the stablecoin market, which has grown small, but if you think about how young it is, $170 billion market that's grown to support those types of use cases, and then you think about, I think your tracker says there are 134 countries that are looking at CBDCs.
Exactly right. Thank you for the plug.
66
I appreciate that. Yeah.
6 or so are like serious about it.
You nailed it. That's exactly
they are,
right.
is behind. But I think the really important part about that inquiry in terms of CBDC is what are the uses, what are the problems that the CBDC is trying to solve? And I think the answer to that question is very different depending on which country you're in.
Sure.
You know, if you're in the Bahamas, it's a different answer than if you're in the European Union. And if the countries and the regions that are developing these CBDCs are thinking about these use cases that I just mentioned that need open, interoperable, public flowing networks, then the frameworks need to have that as part of their design. And so I think, is there a risk? Yes. Is there if some of those uses and the reasons for the CBDC don't involve any of those kind of cross-border global uses, then maybe you're just reinforcing the same and not solving a problem of fragmentation, but just reinforce. I don't think it would, the technology certainly and the frameworks are probably not going to push anything backwards,
right.
But if by design, the outcomes and the solutions that you're trying to reach with this technology, that can do it because it's doing it right now with the stablecoin market.
And they may create new problems. And Saleha, let me come to you on this. You know, we measured since Russia's sovereign assets were, we like to say, blocked at the Geoeconomics Center, not frozen. Semantic. Immobilized. Thank you, Undersecretary. There's been a close to tripling of wholesale CBDC projects around the world. that don't touch the dollar. Now, correlation is not causation. A lot of those projects were underway anyway and would have pursued anyway. But you talked before that the dollar's really not at risk, but we shouldn't be complacent. Play out for us 5 years, how could this develop in a way that is problematic for the dollar?
How could CBDCs?
Or cross-border financial transactions and systems that don't use the dollar more broadly?
I think that the more multinational companies are interested in finding ways to settle contracts outside of the dollar, the more at risk we are, right? I forget the name of the company, but the world's biggest pulp producer, at some point in the last 18 months, started looking into how do we settle trades outside of the dollar. That means they're writing up their contracts in reals or yuan or another currency. And then we're also seeing some of the Gulf states look at finding ways to trade oil without settling those details in the dollar. But I do think that the threat to the dollar, and this is a little bit to the left of your question, but I do think the threat to the dollar is not actually outside the US's border. No CBDC stablecoin, no foreign country can challenge the dollar with their own currency and provide as big of a threat as the US can just domestically, either through not paying attention to the deficit or political instability or kind of violating the pillars of democracy, free and fair elections, independent agencies, public trust in government. These are the bigger threats, I would say.
Do you agree with that, Undersecretary? Deputy Attorney General Monaco earlier today, she said, our common currency is the rule of law. And I thought that was an interesting comment from her.
I think this goes back to what Stefan was saying, that you think of the economics reasons, right? Just the raw, big economy, deepest, most liquid capital markets. That's helpful, right? Because when you transact in a currency, you often want to keep the money in that currency, even if for a short amount of time. So a deep, liquid financial market is a huge asset to being a major currency. That being said, the other piece of it is governance, right? And so rule of law, democracy, a trust in the institutions that are running the economy and regulating the financial system are a huge piece of it. And so I think those pieces are essential, and you wouldn't want to mess with them, I think is the shortest way I would put it. That being said, there's also then this other point around the economics of alternate choices. I think to me, it's one reason it's incumbent on us when you ask, is Treasury thinking about the role of the dollar, is to make the dollar-based system as good as possible and as efficient as possible and as easy to use as possible, because in some sense then you want to make it an expensive choice to go somewhere else. You don't want it actually to be tempting to use a different system. You want it to be something where if someone is transacting outside the dollar system for political reasons, you want them in a sense to be paying a price. You want to say you should stay in this system, and really not just dollar, but I think kind of G7 plus more broadly. You want to be in that ecosystem is as efficient and good. You've got the best governance, the best rule of law, the best financial markets, the best ease of transacting. And so if you went somewhere else, it's a real political choice. That's what you don't want it to be tempting to switch.
No, that's a really good point, and arguably, maybe with digital assets, it becomes a little cheaper than it was otherwise, but that's the question to be evaluated.
Yeah, and with digital assets, I think our view is you're not going to switch currencies because of technology reasons typically, right? I mean, to your point about stable coins, I mean, they're almost all dollar oriented, right? So it's not switching currencies there. I think there around the digital assets, the question is, the current system that is very much based on correspondent banks that are US-oriented correspondent banks and European correspondent banks, switching outside of that system, those banks all have a very, very strong incentive to obey rules and AML-CFT rules and things like that. When you switch to digital assets, those same incentives might not be there for all the firms. That's something we would worry about. And that's less about a switching currency than moving to a technology where people maybe don't follow the rules in the same way. That, again, going back to what we care about is the governance and the rule of law. The current system underpins that. Switching to a different one that doesn't would be something we'd be concerned about.
And Saleha's book, she called SWIFT the crystal ball of financial transactions. And to your point, I think maybe the question is, does the ball get a little cloudy with some of the other systems out there that makes it a little harder to understand what's going on?
Yeah, and it's SWIFT, but not just SWIFT, but the fact that it then runs on banks.
Yeah.
And the banks have an incredibly strong financial incentive to not run afoul of the rules. Yeah. And that's something that works to everybody's benefit from our perspective, not just the US, but anybody transacting in that system. It's not good to have a lot of terrorist financing, to have a lot of illicit activity, to have a lot of things, to have a lot of fraud. We know the banks don't want that because that would undermine their own business model, and the banks don't want one rogue transaction in one spot to get them in trouble and risk the whole business model, so they have a really strong incentive to follow the rules that you might not see in certain digital asset technologies.
Makes sense. Stefan, you brought up the Draghi report earlier, and we're not going to go through all 500 pages of it, but I just want to talk about one issue that feels particularly important for Deutsche Bank and has also really been on the agenda for now as long as I can remember, at least 10 years and maybe before that, capital markets union. I mean, if we're going to talk about things that are in the Draghi report that feel a little more realistic to achieve, that seems like one of them. What's your opinion, and what do you think the roadmap is to make it achievable?
Yeah, so look, I think also in that sense, the report is important because it gives a renewed spotlight on capital markets union in the European Union. And you have seen the reaction of leading politicians in some of the leading economies in Europe that they are picking up. I'm just so say quoting the German Chancellor, but also other members of the current coalition, that they're very dedicated to drive that agenda forward. The real question is which elements of that, right? So if you look at what actually is the capital markets union, it's an amalgamation of, in essence, dozens of different tools that you can improve. Securitization is currently top of the list that politicians are looking at to execute against that. We, as one of the leading European banks and also our partner banks, we are obviously very supportive of that and think that's a good move forward. The real, so to say, proof is in the pudding when it comes to lawmaking then and facing off the European Parliament and the Commission. Let's see whether there will be really, so to say, enough support also from Brussels to pull that through. If you listen to Berlin, I think there are skeptics what really can be achieved. Now, having said all that, I think we should not forget one additional element. Creating a better or more integrated capital markets union is important, and we should always support that, but it's not in itself sufficient, because that's just providing the framework, the regulatory, legal, etc. framework for deeper capital markets. But I think we need to be aware that we need to focus as societies, as economies in Europe and Germany on the forefront. How do we create opportunities, right? We need to create opportunities for investments because there is money sitting on the sidelines. It's not a lack of funding or money there. We need to make sure that we attract these funds and these investors to come into Europe and say, I like this investment, I like that investment, and that's where I put my bet.
Okay, we were in Berlin for this conference last year, and I think there was a more pessimistic take about the future of capital markets union. This feels like a more optimistic take, so that's something
I think there's more optimism currently, but as I said, the proof is in the pudding when it then comes down to can you get lawmakers behind you, and obviously European Union is a complex place to make laws, rules, and regs.
That's the understatement of the conference. Candace, we talked about the illicit side of digital assets, but I want to talk a little bit about the humanitarian side. You're very involved in this. There's been projects in Ukraine. To me, this seems to be one of the most fascinating and important areas and use cases for digital assets. My colleague Ananyu Kumar has written about this in the Gaza context. I wonder if you could speak from your experience, what's happening on the ground.
Absolutely. And I love talking about the actual uses. Use cases sound like they might be happening in the future. This is happening now.
Okay.
Over $4 million has been distributed in Ukraine to internally displaced Ukrainians by the UNHCR and IRC, and they built their solution on the Stellar network. And if you think about it from the different players' perspectives, so if I'm in Ukraine and there's a war and I need to get aid, I don't know, in the beginning, when they first came to us, we didn't know what the Ukrainian banking system's resilience would be. So I'm gonna have to go to a location, a physical location, receive cash. I'm putting a target on my back, on the aid worker's back, and I can only go at certain times. And I need this. I've been displaced. From the UNHCR and the aid organizations, which we've learned is a very competitive market out there. Who's going to give me aid, and how do I build trust with my donors? Well, they have a solution now where instantaneously they can send aid in the form of a US dollar-backed stablecoin, USDC, to aid recipients, some of whom are sitting in a bunker. They can do it 24/7. They don't have to go out into the danger zones. And those recipients in Ukraine, there's not a huge unbanked problem, but some are unbanked. They can go into a MoneyGram location, which is integrated with the Stellar network, get local currency. Some of them may feel like they need to leave Ukraine, and they go to Poland. They go to whatever country they go to on the Stellar network, as long as they have, there's a MoneyGram location, and there are, I think, 300 countries, they can cash out in local currency. So there's this transparency element, there's a safety element, there's a speed element, and Ukraine, so President Zelensky actually came and met with us pre-war and was very fixated on corruption. And obviously they have a strong reputation for corruption, and he was intent on fixing that. And some of that was using the transparent blockchain network. So another endeavor in Ukraine, which is not aid related, but I think will be reconstruction related, is the transparent network, which is the Independent Association of Banks of Ukraine have gotten together, and it's right now in friends and family pilot stage, but an instant payments network, and there are merchants involved, and so people in Ukraine are going to be able to use stable reserve currencies and transact with merchants and have the banking system engaged in that, and it's running on an open public network, the Stellar network, and in anticipation of, I don't know how all of you smart people make these estimations, but $500 billion in reconstruction is what I've seen.
Maybe more.
If that is coming in, and you are a country where corruption is a huge concern, and the speed and of getting that aid into the hands of people who need to use it, a transparent network that is essentially instantaneous is huge. So, so with the corruption concerns, and then with aid, the other stat that always surprises me is that only 30% of aid payments actually get to the recipients, the intended recipients. So if you have a transparent network and you're able to show your donors or show whoever is sending, whether it's for aid or for reconstruction, not who got it, but the path to a wallet address that somebody actually received the aid that you sent. I think each of us would probably are more comfortable with that. Every time there's a crisis and I want to give money, I'm always like, who do I trust? So if you add an element of trust through the technology, you're solving certain problems. Not all of them, but.
Okay, so that was on the more optimistic side. And now, Saleha, I'm going to come back to you on a slightly more pessimistic question, which is we started the day with Ambassador Burns, obviously talking about all the geopolitical challenges facing the US and China and the relationship. And I ended asking about the role of the yuan and internationalization and the future of the dollar, and he punted to Treasury, so the Undersecretary would be happy to hear that. But Saleha, my question for you is, what lesson do you think China has taken from the past few years in the way we in the West and the US have leveraged our economic statecraft tools? They're paying close attention. What does it mean for them, and how do they think about what they've seen?
Yeah, you're coming to the journalist for some cynicism. I think we've revealed our hand a little bit. For a long time, you didn't want to see the biggest economic sanctions package rolled out, or the biggest, let's say, tariffs rolled out. It's like what Hank Paulson said, you have a bazooka, but you don't want to have to take it out. We took it out. When we did the Rusal sanctions, I think the world, on Oleg Deripaska in 2018, and it turns out that because you sanction Oleg Deripaska, you have to sanction anything that he has a majority stake in, and that included Rusal. And so commodities markets, it was one of the world's largest metals makers. Commodities markets are so volatile because of those economic sanctions. And we learn that maybe there are entities or people who are too big to be sanctioned. And then we learn with Russia that even if you have half the world's GDP working together multilaterally to apply sanctions for some very valid reasons, that Russia is not going to crumble. It didn't. It turned into a war economy as the war is still going. So I think the lessons for China are that it might not be as bad as we think it's going to be.
So some of the threat potential or deterrence potential could be lessened by what they've seen.
Yeah, Russia, it turns out, had a very high tolerance for economic pain. I do think that Putin was surprised at how far the U.S. was willing to go, and that turned out to be a sharp tool for the U.S. to wield. And we heard from Dilip today, he was at the forefront of all of that in 2022. But I would imagine China also has a high tolerance.
Well, Undersecretary, let me turn to you on China, and I'm going to just for a moment pivot away from the dollar, but talk about China macro more broadly. You gave, and if folks haven't read it, I really recommend it, an excellent speech. It was another think tank, not our think tank, but it was an excellent speech about China's imbalances. And you had this fascinating line, China manufacturing untethered to global demand. That really stuck out to me in the speech. But the IMF wrote last week, and I thought it was kind of an interesting blog, not contradicting that point, but offering nuances to that point on imbalances. And as we think about competition with China more broadly, and obviously the yuan is just one measure of that competition, I wonder if you could just describe how you see the imbalances in the manufacturing overcapacity issue, because it does connect to how China internationalizes its currency.
Yeah, thanks. So, yes, and actually I read that IMF piece, and the funny thing is I don't think we actually disagree very much at all. I think they were kind of arguing against a straw man from someone else, not really us, but I think what we see is the fundamental issue in China, macro-wise, is they have had an absurdly high level of savings basically forever, right? And if you stretch back a long ways, there was a point in time at which that savings has to go somewhere. For a while, they were running a really big current account surplus, to the extent that it was somewhat controversial around the world. That went away when they ratcheted up investment in the property sector and in infrastructure. Both of those uses effectively ran out of steam in the last few years. And so now, if you actually look, and there's a figure in that speech, the speech is very weedy, there are footnotes and figures and all sorts of fun stuff, because we wanted to really lay out the details of the case intellectually. And you can see lending to the property sector going down like this, and almost one for one, lending to the manufacturing sector just ratcheting up. And that's not a pure market outcome, right? That's state direction there. And so I think our concern is that you're taking this large amount of savings, and from our perspective, the subsidies in the industrial policy aren't causing the imbalances. That was what the IMF was pointing out, and we agree with that. We don't argue that they do. What we're saying is the subsidies in the industrial policy kind of channel those imbalances towards specific sectors, and that's why they become untethered to global demand, and why they become really problematic for everyone else in terms of spillovers. And what we try to say to the Chinese, it's not 1992 anymore. You're not a very small open economy. You're 30% of global manufacturing. If you try to grow faster than everybody else and try to be led by manufacturing, that's not just growing along with demand, that's starting to displace everyone else, leading to overconcentration, especially in some industries, and other countries aren't just going to watch that. They're going to say, either for national security reasons, being concerned about concentration in one country of critical industries, or for economics reasons where they say, you're letting your firms lose money for 5 years on end. My firms can't do that. That's going to lead to bad outcomes for us. One way or the other countries are going to respond. And what we've tried to say to them is, this isn't going to be anti-China. This isn't trying to hold you back. This is a defensive reaction to spillovers from your policies. And you have agency here. You can change those policies and not wind up in this place.
In the morning, Ambassador Burns said what struck him the most was how the global South was responding to some of this. And we were comparing the earlier China shock in the 2000s to now, and that seemed to be a key difference he pointed out.
Yeah, and it really depends on if you're a producer or consumer of a particular good. The response almost goes good by good, that if you don't make solar panels and China wants to sell them at a massive loss, you might just buy them. But anything that you are making, where you're seeing this overcapacity start spilling over, countries are responding. There's a huge growing wave of anti-dumping petitions, in steel, solar for India, steel across like half the world. And you've seen Europe with their countervailing duties on EVs, the US with its tariffs on EVs. So it's not, and what we tried to convey back in February when we were really pushing this point with them, and then with Secretary Yellen in April, was this isn't just going to be us. It's going to be everybody, because you're big enough that you're disrupting everybody in a sense.
Well, Stefan, that's a good pivot to you. What about Europe on China? I mean, how you think about this as a multinational bank, and how you think about the integration between the European economy and China, and how more broadly you have to think about geopolitics in your banking in the day-to-day than maybe a few years ago you didn't.
Well, a couple of things I would say. First of all, before I turn to banking, obviously Europe and Germany in particular has a bit more complicated situation in terms of geoeconomics with China, especially because of the huge exposure of trade, but also direct investments and reliance on supply, but also demand in China, OEMs, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and other industries. So I think for us, in relative terms, that problem is bigger than it is for you, and you see that leads you to outcomes that German OEMs are not in favor of tariffs and trade restrictions for Chinese EVs because they fear, so to say, the answer from China. So that is more complex. And if you then dive deeper, obviously depending on what industry you look at, it's also not easy to solve, right? I mean, you could make the case, well, too bad for the OEMs, they just took the wrong bet and now they need to bite the bullet. But if you look at it a bit more closer, or you turn to chemicals, it's just different, because China is a different chemical market. So if you're not there, if you don't put your bets there and invest like BASF there, then it's hard to be a large player in that field. So very complicated and not easy to solve setup, and I'm not sure that there will be a quick answer to that. And for sure it's not decoupling is the answer. If there's an answer, it's probably more local for local, right? So keep your assets there, but have them produce local for the local market, and try to turn international trade to more foreign direct investments that are managed local for local. I think that is more where the answers sit. Now for banking, and that's not only for a bank like us, but also for some of our US competitors, you need to operate a global network to be relevant for global clients, and that will also persist. I think what we will see in the next couple of years is how does that play out in the context of geoeconomics and geoeconomic statecraft, or put it in other terms, and Undersecretary, you mentioned it, there are areas where the Western world, led by the US and Europe, will require that you make calls, right? Where are you? Where are you positioned? Where's your loyalty? You mentioned payment system. What payment system are you operating in, right? So these bets and these calls we will need to make, and we will be forced to balance that with operating a global network and not saying, okay, then we cut off complete regions or industries. And that will be the challenge for global banks like us, but also some of our competitors.
Thank you. So I'm almost out of time, but I have a lightning round for the three of you. One question each, 1 minute each, so no pressure on that. Candace, I'm going to start with you. Is there a tension between DeFi and the ethos of DeFi and the fact, as the Undersecretary said, something like 98% or 99% of all stable coins are pegged to the dollar? Is there something here in that world that has to be resolved?
I don't think so. I think actually like the Ukraine example is a good one, that certainly there are people in the ecosystem, in the crypto, in the DeFi world who just think it all has to be completely decentralized and it's an alternative system. That has never been the position that the foundation has taken. This is just another option. It's another way of enhancing the existing system and interconnecting with it. So there are parts of the blockchain technology about speed, transparency, limiting the number of intermediaries and limiting those number of hops, but not eliminating any sense of AML and CFT, because that, so there are certain elements. So if you can have a stable dollar token and be able to help people who don't have access to a banking system to get into the system and to have more access to everyday financial products and services. And some of that is because it's on an open, public, decentralized network, because they can't trust their banking system. They're not allowed into it. It's a combination, and so I don't think that they are completely in tension. I think that they are complementary, and everything needs to interoperate, and we need to be thinking about that by design, and we need to be thinking about what are the problems we're trying to solve, and pick the right pieces and put them together, as opposed to saying, here's like one solution is completely decentralized and one is completely centralized. So we all have to work together and interoperate.
Yeah, I think that's a great message. And what are the goals we're trying to achieve here versus the tools we get there? Undersecretary, to you, what initiative should we look for from Treasury in the way forward when it comes to preserving the competitiveness of the dollar? I'm thinking of Fed now. The U.S. is going to host the G20 in 2026, which is just around the corner. Yeah. Are there things, we talked about why the dollar is in a stable position, but what are the forward-looking proactive things we should look for to preserve that status?
So I think Fed now is part of it, and so that's obviously the Fed, not Treasury, but we see that as an important, having kind of a fast payment system is an important piece there. We, alongside the Fed, are talking to a lot of countries about how you would interlink fast payment systems, not saying you could do it immediately. We're not asking the Fed to, it'd be their choice, but also the system has to get up and running first. But mostly it's about trying to work with other countries on how these things would take place, because even if you're not ready to do it now, you want to start that process. We're working a lot through there's something called the G20 cross-border roadmap, and we spent a lot of time on that, where it's really about, from our perspective, the legal and regulatory pieces of things and the rules around data and privacy and things like that. Those things, they're the same challenges we face in cross-border payments today are going to exist regardless of technology, right? Around when it comes to the legal and regulatory frameworks, who owns the data, what are the privacy rules, all of those things. How do you do AML, CFT, as you said? Like there's the same problems. It doesn't matter what the technology is. And so from our perspective, trying to do the work behind the scenes to be ready for whichever way technology is pivoting, and however we're trying to interlink with the rest of the world to make sure that we are ready to kind of be at the forefront is our goal.
Thank you. Saleha, final word to you. We got through the whole session and most of the conference without talking about the election, but I can't, 6 weeks out, avoid saying it because it does weigh on the future of the dollar. And I wonder from your perspective how you see the situations playing out that we described about the domestic issues that can drive the dollar. If we're meeting a year from now, what are the scenarios we're thinking about and how they might impact the future of the dollar?
I mean, the one that there is very little motivation in Washington to work on is the deficit. That is probably the biggest domestic threat to the dollar. The other one is something that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen talked about today in an interview to Politico. She said that what she thinks is the biggest threat to our financial system is a transfer of power that's not peaceful in America. And that goes back to an earlier comment that I made that, rule of law is important to the dollar. So if in a year from now, that's what we're talking about, that there was a lot of political violence and, democracy looked like it was crumbling, that's not a good situation. After January 6th, Bob Rubin, who was a Treasury Secretary during the Clinton administration, he was the father of the strong dollar policy, hugely influential on US currency policy. He wrote an op-ed and he said that faith in democracy and faith in markets go hand in hand. And that, to me, it really resonated. And we heard that from Yellen today.
I don't think there are any better notes to end this panel on and to really end this day on. And I want to thank our distinguished guests for being with us. Please join me in thanking our panel.